New Orleans, 1918. 17-year-old Louis Armstrong had been out of the reform school for 5 years and was trying to make a living with music. But that day, a white teacher from the city's most respected music school looked at Louis and said words that stabbed into his heart like a dagger in front of everyone. "A black child can never be a real singer. Your voice is too rough, your style too primitive. Give up music and find another job." Louis stayed silent in that moment. He lowered his head, but something inside him broke, or perhaps began to awaken. Because 3 hours later, that same teacher and 150 people would stand applauding Louis Armstrong's performance, tears streaming down their faces, and that teacher would realize he had made the biggest mistake of his life. So what did Louis do in those 3 hours? And why did that performance become legendary? The answer tells not just music history, but the beginning of a silent war against prejudice. But to understand what happened that spring evening, we need to go back a few weeks to see what Louis had been enduring and why this moment would change everything. If this story has captured your attention, please subscribe to our channel. Because what you're about to discover reveals one of the most powerful moments in music history, a moment when a 17-year-old boy proved that talent has no color. 3 weeks before that fateful performance, Louis Armstrong was living in a tiny room above a coal yard in the Storyville district of New Orleans. The room was barely large enough for a bed and a chair, but it was all Louis could afford with the money he earned playing cornet at funeral parades and small dance halls. Every morning, Louis woke up at 5 to help unload coal from delivery wagons, backbreaking work that paid pennies. Then he would wash the coal dust from his hands and face, grab his cornet, and head out to find musical work for the day. The physical exhaustion was constant, but Louis never complained. He had learned years ago at the colored waif's home that complaining changed nothing. Only work mattered. Only improvement mattered. Only proving yourself over and over again could earn you the right to exist in a world that told you every day that you didn't belong. But lately something new had been weighing on Louis's mind. He wanted to be more than just a cornet player for hire. He wanted to sing. When Louis sang, something magical happened. His rough, gravelly voice had a warmth and expressiveness that made people stop and listen. He had been practicing singing in his tiny room late at night, working on breath control, on phrasing, on how to tell a story through a song. His neighbors complained about the noise, but Louis kept working. Because Louis had a secret dream. He wanted to perform at the Roseland Theater, the most prestigious venue in New Orleans. The Roseland only hired the best musicians, and they had never hired a black teenager to sing. But Louis believed that if he was good enough, if he worked hard enough, maybe, just maybe, they would give him a chance. The information in this video is compiled from documented interviews, archival news, books, and historical reports. For narrative purposes, some parts are dramatized and may not represent 100% factual accuracy. We also use AI-assisted visuals and AI narration for cinematic reconstruction. The use of AI does not mean the story is fake. It is a storytelling tool. Our goal is to recreate the spirit of that era as faithfully as possible. Enjoy watching. Then came the afternoon that would test everything Louis believed about himself. It was late April, and Louis had heard that a famous music critic named Mr. Whitmore was visiting New Orleans from Chicago. Whitmore was known for discovering talent and helping young musicians get opportunities in the big cities. Louis knew this was his chance. He put on his one good shirt, polished his worn shoes, and went to the community center where Whitmore was holding informal auditions. When Louis arrived, the room was full of young musicians, almost all of them white. They stared at Louis as he walked in, but Louis was used to those stares. He found a seat in the back and waited his turn. For 3 hours, he watched other musicians perform. Some were talented, some were not, but Whitmore gave each one thoughtful feedback and encouragement. Finally, Louis's name was called. He walked to the front of the room, his heart pounding so hard he thought everyone could hear it. He didn't have his cornet with him. Today he wanted to sing. Louis stood in front of the 40 people in that room and said quietly, "I'd like to sing When the Saints Go Marching In." Whitmore looked at Louis for a long moment, then nodded. Louis opened his mouth and began to sing. His voice was rough, yes, but it was also full of soul and genuine emotion. He poured everything he had into that song, all the years of poverty, all the nights of hunger, all the moments of being told he wasn't good enough. The room went silent. People leaned forward to hear better. Lewis's voice filled the space with a power and authenticity that couldn't be faked or taught. When Lewis finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Whitmore stood up. But instead of applauding, instead of offering encouragement like he had done for every other performer, Whitmore looked at Louis with cold eyes and said words that would echo in Louis's mind for years. "Young man, I appreciate your effort, but I must be honest with you. Your voice is too coarse, too unrefined. You have no formal training, and it shows. A black child from the streets can never be a professional singer. My advice to you is to give up this dream and find work that suits your background." The room went silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence, the uncomfortable silence of witnessing cruelty. Louis stood there, frozen. He felt 40 pairs of eyes on him, waiting to see how he would react. Would he cry? Would he argue? Would he run away? Do you think Louis should have defended himself in that moment, or was his silence more powerful? Let me know in the comments. Louis did none of those things. He simply said, "Thank you, sir," and walked out of the room. He walked through the streets of New Orleans in a daze, Whitmore's words playing over and over in his mind. A black child from the streets can never be a professional singer. Louis had heard variations of this message his entire life, but somehow, having it said out loud by someone respected in the music world made it feel more real, more final. When Louis got back to his tiny room above the coal yard, he sat on his bed and stared at his cornet. For the first time in years, he thought about quitting music entirely. Maybe Whitmore was right. Maybe he was fooling himself. Maybe he should just accept his place in the world and stop dreaming of something more. But then Louis remembered something his music teacher from the waif's home, Peter Davis, had told him years ago. "Louis, people will tell you what you can't do. Don't listen to them. Listen to the music inside you. That's the only truth that matters." Louis picked up his cornet and began to play. He played for an hour, working through his favorite melodies, feeling the music heal the wound that Whitmore's words had created. And as he played, an idea began to form in his mind, a wild, impossible idea that would require every ounce of courage he possessed. Louis decided he was going to prove Whitmore wrong, not with words, but with music. He was going to get himself onto the stage of the Roseland Theater and give a performance so powerful, so undeniable, that even Whitmore would have to admit he had been wrong. If you're enjoying this story of courage and determination, please hit that subscribe button. Louis's journey is far from over. The next morning, Louis went to see Papa Joe, the manager of the Roseland Theater. Papa Joe was a kind man who had given Louis small jobs at the theater, carrying instruments, setting up chairs, cleaning after shows. Louis had never asked Papa Joe for anything more than work, but today was different. "Papa Joe," Louis said, his voice steady despite his nervousness, "I want to perform at the Roseland. I want to sing." Papa Joe looked at Louis with surprise and concern. "Louis, you know I like you. You're a good kid, hard-working. But the Roseland has never had a Negro singer perform on that stage. The white folks who come here, they wouldn't accept it." Louis nodded. "I know. But there's a charity event next week, right? The one for the Children's Hospital? What if I performed there? It's for charity. People might be more open to it." Papa Joe thought about it for a long moment. The charity event was important to him. His own daughter had been treated at that children's hospital. He wanted it to be special, memorable. And there was something in Louis's eyes, a determination and hunger, that Papa Joe recognized. He had seen that same look in other great musicians. "All right," Papa Joe finally said, "but just one song. And if people don't like it, you stop immediately. Deal?" Louis's face broke into a huge smile. "Deal. Thank you, Papa Joe. You won't regret this." For the next week, Louis worked harder than he had ever worked in his life. During the day, he still hauled coal and played at funeral parades, but every spare moment he practiced singing. He worked on the song he had chosen, "When the Saints Go Marching In," until he could perform it perfectly. He practiced his stage presence, his gestures, how to connect with an audience. He borrowed a better shirt from a friend. He polished his shoes until they shone. The night of the charity event arrived. The Roseland Theater was packed with 150 people, doctors, lawyers, business owners, all of New Orleans' white elite. They had come to support the Children's Hospital and to be entertained by the city's finest musicians. The evening's program included a string quartet, a classical pianist, and a popular jazz band. And somewhere in that program, buried between two other acts, was Louis Armstrong's name. Louis arrived at the theater 2 hours early. He stood backstage, listening to the other performers, feeling his nervousness build. His hands were shaking. His throat felt tight. This was the biggest opportunity of his life, and he was terrified of failing. Then, just as Louis was about to go on, someone tapped his shoulder. It was Mr. Whitmore. "What are you doing here?" Whitmore asked, his voice cold. Louis met his eyes. "I'm performing tonight, sir." Whitmore's face hardened. "I see Papa Joe has made a mistake in judgment. Well, I'll be watching. And when you fail, and you will fail, perhaps you'll finally understand that some dreams are not meant for people like you." Whitmore walked away, leaving Louis standing alone in the wings. But instead of crushing Louis's spirit, Whitmore's words did something unexpected. They ignited a fire inside him. Louis realized that this performance wasn't just about proving himself anymore. It was about proving something for every black child who had been told they couldn't, for every person who had been judged by their skin rather than their talent. This was bigger than Louis Armstrong. This was about justice. The announcer's voice rang out. "And now, for our next performance, please welcome Louis Armstrong." Louis walked onto the Roseland stage for the first time in his life. The stage lights were bright, almost blinding. He could barely see the audience, but he could feel their confusion, their skepticism. A black teenager on the Roseland stage? This was unprecedented. Louis stood at the microphone and said simply, "I'd like to sing 'When the Saints Go Marching In for You Tonight.' This song is for every child in that hospital, fighting their own battle, showing courage every day." The audience settled into a polite but wary silence. And then Louis began to sing. What happened next would be talked about in New Orleans for decades. Louis didn't just sing the song, he transformed it. His rough, gravelly voice took those familiar lyrics and infused them with so much emotion, so much soul, that the song became something new entirely. He sang about hope in the face of despair. He sang about faith when everything seemed lost. He sang about the triumph of the human spirit over every obstacle. And as he sang, something magical happened in that theater. The skeptical faces in the audience began to change. Hardened businessmen found tears in their eyes. Elegant society women clutched their handkerchiefs. Even the musicians backstage stopped what they were doing to listen. Louis wasn't just performing. He was testifying, he was preaching, he was pouring his entire soul into every note. When Louis hit the final note and let it ring out through the theater, there was complete silence. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved, nobody breathed. Louis stood on that stage, his heart pounding, wondering if he had failed after all. Then the applause started. It began with one person standing up, then another, until the entire audience was on their feet, clapping so hard their hands hurt. The applause went on for 5 minutes straight. People were crying, shouting, "Bravo!" demanding an encore. Papa Joe came rushing onto the stage, tears streaming down his face, and hugged Louis. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," he said. "You just made history, son." But the most important moment came a few minutes later, backstage. Mr. Whitmore approached Louis. The critic's face was pale and his eyes were red. He stood in front of Louis for a long moment, and then he did something that shocked everyone who witnessed it. He extended his hand and said, "I was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. You have a gift that transcends anything I've ever heard. I apologize for my ignorance and my cruelty. Would you allow me to help you get to Chicago? I have connections there. You deserve to be heard by the world." Louis looked at Whitmore's outstretched hand. This was the man who had tried to destroy his dream. This was the man who had said a black child could never be a professional singer. Every instinct told Louis to reject the apology, to turn away, to make Whitmore feel the same shame and hurt that Louis had felt. But Louis Armstrong was not a man of bitterness or revenge. He was a man of music and love. Lewis took Whitmore's hand and shook it firmly. "Thank you, sir. I accept your apology, and yes, I'd appreciate any help you can offer." Whitmore nodded, unable to speak, and walked away. What Louis didn't know in that moment was that this handshake would change his life. True to his word, Whitmore used his connections to get Lewis opportunities in Chicago and beyond. Within 4 years, Louis would be playing with King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band. Within 6 years, he would revolutionize jazz with his Hot 5 recordings. Within a decade, he would be known around the world. But none of it would have happened without that night at the Roseland Theater when a 17-year-old boy with a dream chose courage over fear, chose hope over bitterness, and chose to let his talent speak louder than any hateful words ever could. What would you have done in Lewis's position? Accepted Whitmore's help or rejected it? I'd love to hear your thoughts. The story of Louis Armstrong at 17 is more than just a story about one performance. It's a story about what happens when talent meets determination, when courage meets opportunity. It's a story about the power of music to break down barriers and change hearts. And it's a reminder that the people who tell you what you can't do are often the same people who will be first in line to apologize when you prove them wrong. Louis Armstrong went on to become one of the most influential musicians in history, not just because of his talent, but because he refused to let anyone else define what was possible for him. That 17-year-old boy standing on the Roseland stage singing with everything he had wasn't just performing a song. He was declaring his humanity, his worth, his right to dream. Years later, when Louis Armstrong was famous and touring the world, a reporter asked him about that night at the Roseland. "Mr. Armstrong, how did you find the courage to get on that stage after what Whitmore had said to you?" Louis thought for a moment, then smiled that famous smile and said, "Courage? I don't know if it was courage. I just knew that if I didn't try, if I let his words stop me, then he would have been right. Not about my talent, but about my spirit. And I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let him kill the music inside me." The reporter pressed further. "But weren't you afraid of failing?" Louis nodded. "Terrified. But I realized something that day. There are two kinds of failure. There's the failure of trying and falling short. And there's the failure of never trying at all. The second kind is the only one I couldn't live with." On that spring night in 1918, something fundamental shifted in Louis Armstrong's understanding of himself and his place in the world. He had walked onto that stage as a scared, 17-year-old boy carrying the weight of every racist insult, every closed door, every person who had told him to know his place. But he walked off that stage as Louis Armstrong, not a black musician or a poor musician or a young musician, but simply a musician pure and undeniable. The applause that night wasn't just for a good performance. It was recognition, finally, of a truth that Louis had always known, but that the world needed to hear. Greatness recognizes no boundaries. Talent respects no prejudice. And music, real music, speaks a language that everyone understands, regardless of the color of the performer's skin. Mr. Whitmore's apology that night was important, but not because Louis needed it. Louis had already proven what he needed to prove to himself. Whitmore's apology mattered because it showed that even the most hardened prejudices can crack when confronted with undeniable excellence. It showed that people can change, that hearts can open, that the arc of justice really does bend, but only when someone has the courage to pull it. And Louis Armstrong, at just 17 years old, had pulled it with everything he had. He pulled it with every note he sang, with every ounce of soul he poured into that performance, with every bit of dignity he maintained in the face of cruelty. He didn't win by fighting hate with hate. He won by fighting hate with beauty. The final truth of this story is this: Louis Armstrong succeeded not despite what Whitmore said to him, but in a strange way, because of it. Those cruel words ignited something in Louis that might have remained dormant. They gave him a purpose beyond just performing well. They gave him something to prove, not to Whitmore, but to himself and to everyone who would come after him. Every black musician who followed Louis, every artist who was told they couldn't, every dreamer who was told to give up, they all owed a debt to that 17-year-old boy who refused to accept someone else's limitations. And somewhere in the universe, that performance still echoes. Not just the notes Lewis sang, but the message behind them. You don't get to tell me who I am or what I can become. Only I get to decide that, and I choose greatness.